Hey everyone, welcome back to the What Should You Do podcast with me, Ellie, and Alex here, my co-host. Today we have Ed Conley on the pod, who is a nationally recognized crisis leadership expert with nearly 30 years at FEMA, where he helped lead over 200 major disaster response operations to include 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, and Superstorm Sandy. He is a former U.S. liaison to NATO and a trusted advisor to government and defense organizations worldwide. Ed now mentors emerging crisis leaders and serves as a sought-after speaker and subject matter expert. He is the author of Promote the Dog Sitter and Other Principles for Leading During Disasters, which is an award-winning book on practical leadership under pressure. So thanks so much, Ed, for coming on today. We're really excited to have some time to chat with you.
Ellie, Alex, thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Of course. So I guess to start us off, kind of what got you started at FEMA. Did your career start there, or were you somewhere else beforehand?
I was actually on the ski patrol in California. So I was a first responder. I was an emergency medical technician. Ellie, I loved it. I loved being in the mountains. I was always just scanning the slopes for someone who may be in trouble. Just like all the ski patrollers, that was sort of the mindset. When the bell rang, we all would we all wanted to be there. We all wanted to show up. We all wanted to be a part. We were all well trained and confident in our ability to help and maybe make the situation a little bit better. The problem with it didn't pay anything. I wasn't making any money. And so I go, I love this business. I love to be part of emergency situations, and I like to do it as a career, but I need to get paid for it. So I discovered FEMA, which at the time was a relatively known agency. It had only been created in 1979, and it was just sort of getting its footing. But I discovered it, and I applied, and I got into this leadership training program, which is fabulous. And so for 2 years, I rotated through every office in the agency. I worked in the Office of General Counsel, I worked in National Security, I worked in disaster response, I worked in the graphics department, I worked at the National Emergency Training Center, and so I just really got to see the full scope of the agency's responsibilities and capabilities, and I met everyone. I think I met just about everyone who worked for FEMA. And so that kind of lifted me up. About 3 months into getting hired, Hurricane Hugo hit, which was a really large-scale catastrophic hurricane that slammed into the Virgin Islands, and then Puerto Rico, then South Carolina, then up to North Carolina. And I got sent to Puerto Rico. And that was my first disaster assignment. And that sort of cemented my belief that I had picked the right agency and the right career, because I just fell in love with the mission and the opportunity to be a part of something that big and that exciting and figure out a way to try to contribute. And anyway, I was just kind of an intern, but I tried to just help out, make small contributions, and to be a part of it. And I just knew after that okay, this is the right career and the right job for me.
No, that's really amazing. Based off of the bio that we read, you definitely have throughout your career the opportunity, but I guess opportunity is the right word, to work some major crisis events that have happened across the United States, and I'm sure even globally. Do you have any that kind of stick out to you that you got to work, some of the other agencies that contributed, and what that kind of looks like when a disaster event really does happen?
Sure. Well, I'll tackle the first part of your question first, because I think that's really an essential part of understanding how emergency management works, not only in the United States, but across the world. And it's a coordinating role, and it's not a first response role. It's not necessarily flying the helicopters or loading up the supplies, but it's bringing all the different skills and agencies and capabilities together as one team, so that we're the best of the best, we're not duplicating efforts, and we have a common set of priorities, and we're working together to implement them. And so that's the way it's structured. Any disaster response that I was involved with FEMA, and I was involved with hundreds, we were always there in a partnership. We were there in partnerships with local communities, with the state, with other federal agencies, with the volunteer organizations, and with the impacted community and the survivors themselves. So every effort is always a joint effort. The few that stand out in my mind, I mean, the big historical ones that are in the history books and they make movies about, obviously, 9/11, Katrina. I was on Deepwater Horizon, the oil spill in the Gulf in 2010. I was there for about 6 months. Detail with FEMA did have a role there, but I was loaned out to the Coast Guard, so I worked for the Coast Guard for about 6 months. So those ones, definitely stand out. But then there's, lots of different small ones that where I just met incredible people, was involved in different things, and I learned a lot. Grand Forks, North Dakota in 1997. That was famous for a long time because it was a big catastrophic flood. And I spent a year there with that community during the recovery. Their local leadership was so strong and so positive and had such will and determination that they were going to recover from this event. And they knew it was going to take them 10 years, 15 years to do it. But they just were relentlessly optimistic, building partnerships, positive, criticizing in private, but praising always in public to keep the team intact. And I just learned so much. And I think that's, as I kind of grew into this job, Ellie and Alex, that's what kept me going, is that on every disaster, you see a lot of bad things, but you always remember the good, way more than the bad. And you meet just incredible people who have stepped up in that moment and maybe have been overlooked and underestimated their whole lives and their whole career, but something about that disaster brings out something special in them. And then you get to be a part of that and maybe take a part of that and make it who you are. You get to capture all those things, and just whether it's the way they communicate, whether the way they treat people, the phrasing they use in certain crisis situations, their framework for managing tough challenges that pop up, all that. And so I just tried to pay attention, and I just tried to keep the best of the best. I just feel really fortunate that it's not a bad way to live a career or live a life.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then for people who don't know much about FEMA and much about, the type of disasters that they respond to, and I feel like I also don't maybe have a full understanding of like the bandwidth that FEMA may cover. So like I know natural disasters, think fires, floods, hurricane response, things of that nature, but what disasters and what type of response or what type of situations is FEMA responding to?
Okay, so FEMA is really focused on the consequences of events. So any sort of event, whether it's a natural hazards, as mentioned, like a fire, flood, earthquake, or a man-caused event like a terrorism attack, anything that has broad consequences that exceed the capability of the local community and the state to respond to, that's when FEMA traditionally gets involved. So it can really be a broad range of events. Now, there are certain federal agencies that have jurisdictions, funding, and authorities to deal with certain things, such as an oil spill, and that's the Coast Guard. Public health emergency, that's typically CDC. However, in COVID, FEMA was brought in to help assist CDC. We became almost like a co-partner in that sort of things.
Okay.
The benefit, I think, of having a FEMA or FEMA-type organization in the U.S. or really in any country is that you have people who are every day of their lives are thinking about what might happen and what the potential consequences may be and how many people impacted. And then they're also thinking, okay, who do we need to coordinate with to help out? And I always found, in my experience working with other federal agencies, I worked a lot with the FBI and all that, CDC, we're one of the few agencies that we were just taught, it was constantly pounded into us, we are a coordinating agency. We're not necessarily in charge, we're not necessarily lead agency, but it's our job to bring everyone together to help the mission be successful. And I think that's kind of the strength of FEMA. So you can sort of plug us in anywhere and we'll figure out, okay, who do we need to tap into to try to get the job done?
I feel like that's always very needed when it comes to the government space, because I feel like sometimes there's obviously organizations that aren't like in that plug and play role. And then when coordination happens or like one's on scene and another one, it becomes a little more chaotic because I think sometimes people might not always know where like those lanes cross. And so being like that coordination effort, I feel like always kind of helps get people working more in like a cohesive manner versus like this agency just doing this thing and then this other agency doing doing their thing, and sometimes information sharing doesn't happen as efficiently.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, it's a special type of skill and talent. I think it's just, FEMA, for FEMA to do its job, we need the help of everyone else. So we got to build relationships. We have to bury our egos. We have to, we're very mindful of, that we're a constitutional republic in the United States, and the states are in charge. And so the governor's priorities need to be our priorities when FEMA's involved in a disaster recovery event. And so that sort of, legal structure and that sort of funding approach and that authority that we're based on just requires an ability to understand how to coordinate and how to prop up other people to be successful.
For someone who's interested in this, and I don't want to derail the conversation, but somebody who's interested in this as a career opportunity, I hear that, you, from my understanding, you joined in 1989 and then you went on deployment. I guess I don't know if that's the right terminology.
It is.
But how many deployments, if I join FEMA and I have a family, how many deployments should I expect, and what does that rotation look like from a responder's perspective?
Right. Well, Alex, there's a lot. First of all, I encourage anyone who's interested in the field of emergency management to pursue it. And you don't have to necessarily work at the federal level, the national level. Every state has an emergency management office. Every county has an emergency management office. Most of your larger cities have an emergency management office. There's also emergency management programs in different agencies too. So there's lots of different avenues to work in this field. And then when you're in this field, there are different career tracks. You can work maybe more on the planning side. You can work on disaster mitigation, which is looking at efforts long before disaster strikes or after disaster strikes to reduce the impact of future events. And typically, a lot of those types of jobs don't require extended deployments or frequent deployments. But if you go on the disaster response and recovery side, like I did, then you have to be willing to make those sacrifices. And it's somewhat different than a military deployment. Lots of times with the military deployment, you'll get like 6 to 8 months lead time, right, to get everything in place. When you work with FEMA, it's like the phone rings and can you go to Guam and be there tomorrow? And it may be a month, it may be 6 months. So it's a very unpredictable lifestyle, and it can be a real struggle and strain on families and relationships. The agency does try to accommodate that. Over the years, we tried to limit the length of deployments. We tried to give people, after every 30 days, a chance to come home, or maybe even try to limit deployments to 30 days. But the downside of that's a burden then on the community, where they're constantly building new relationships, and people, are losing all the institutional knowledge of a disaster recovery effort. A new team comes in. It's just it's just something you have to think through. I found that over the years that as I got more experience, I could say, hey, I need some time. I'm stepping out for a bit. You got to find someone else. And unless it was like a Katrina or 9/11, that was an all hands deck. The agency was very accommodating at that. So I hope that answered your question.
No, it does. It's a super interesting career field to go down. Most people think of deployments from a military perspective.
Right.
But this, especially with no notice, you're almost like a flyaway team, like a tier 1 element for a special operations unit. In a sense, the timing is very similar.
It is. We use, it's interesting you mentioned, because we use a lot of military terminology in FEMA, and we have a lot of former military in our agency, but we're very much a civilian organization. And, it's funny, I still say we. I just can't.
Can't shake
They
it.
are. You can't shake it. Very much a civilian organization. And so we have, and so it's kind of a cool culture. It's a little bit, we say words like Roger that, copy, bluff, bottom line up front, and but we don't salute, we don't march.
Yeah, there's a reason why
Nice.
all that exists is speed and time. Those words and being very direct and succinct is because you have a limited amount of time and you're dealing with sometimes sensitive activities or people's lives. So operating in a kind of a military mindset where it's very structured and systematic makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I would say the other parallels, time is, you absolutely hit it on time. We say Time's our most precious asset. That's the one thing you can never get back in a disaster response. And typically in a big catastrophic event where lives are threatened, you have about 72 hours to get in there and start to stabilize it.
From my side, I kind of want to touch on, a lot of our listeners um, are more so the ones that are impacted by situations that happen, catastrophic events. I think with the way that the political climate is evolving right now, both internationally as well as here in the US, I think there's this heightened sense of, fear and kind of what do you do if situation. Ironically, our podcast is the What Should You Do podcast, where we want to kind of give some tactical level advice to our listeners to kind of navigate some of these more complex situations. And so for the people listening, what are some tangible things? And I know, for example, in your book, Promote the Dog Sitter, for example, where we kind of go into that leadership role in crisis events. What can people that are listening that aren't first responders, don't come from military backgrounds, what can they do that kind of puts them in a leadership role in the event of a crisis situation that can help them, their families, the people around them, hopefully have a successful get out or go to cover, or what can they expect until that 72 hours where FEMA can come in and stabilize, and first responders and other units as well?
Yeah, well, I think it's begin with that, everyone is to some extent a first responder. And you're a first responder for your family, and you may be a first responder for your neighborhood. And so everyone in a big disaster to some extent is going to be called upon to be a first responder. So, at the very tactical level, Ellie, you might want to learn some basic first aid. Basic first aid, CPR. Make sure that you have, captured records, your insurance records, your driver's license. Just take pictures of stuff. You have it on your phone. Review your insurance policies, all those sorts of basics. But then we get into the, interesting part of the discussion, and, what kind of separates people who are able to rise to the moment as opposed to people struggle. Let me begin with this. My theory, just based on observation, actually review some scientific material, I think we tend to underestimate people's ability to handle difficult situations. I think the most overused and inappropriate word or phrase that I see in disaster situations is public panic. I don't believe it's panic. I think it's fear, maybe, which is totally different than panic. Fear is a very rational thing, and when you have fear, you tend to focus more. You often tend to do the right thing, whether it's rushing away from the tsunami or trying to get out of the Twin Towers after the planes hit. That's different. I really don't see panic. And so it bothers me when the presumption is that people will panic in catastrophic situations, because I just don't see it. I don't see it. There are rare occasions, but I think people mostly have very rational. So I think believe in yourself. Believe in yourself. That you'll be able to sort of sort through that. And here's some sort of the mental part of it that I always tell people. First of all, show up. Show up for your family, show up your neighborhood. Trust in your ability to figure it out. And just by showing up, and whether it's, I dealt with a situation where my dad went into hospice, and it was about a month before he passed. And I'd never been in a hospice situation, but I always had this philosophy that no matter what, I was going to show up in difficult family situations. And so I did, and I just handled it. And you just figured these things out. The second sort of mental trick that works a lot for people is kind of a thinking in threes philosophy, and just sort of break things down. When a crisis hits, pick three things you're going to do, and don't overthink it. Any three things. I don't care whether it's where we're going to sleep tonight, or do I put jelly or honey on my peanut butter sandwich. Any three things, just to get the momentum going and be able to practice and break the pie down into smaller pieces so you don't get so overwhelmed. And just sort of practicing this mental ability to sort of organize yourself into thinking in threes. And you can use this for anything in life, whether you're doing a talk, whether you're on a podcast, whether you're talking to one of your kids who, wants to drop out of school and go to Croatia, for any sort of family or personal or professional situation, this sort of thinking in threes mindset is really valuable in a crisis. One example is just picking three priorities, getting the momentum, deciding what you do, and taking action. Another way to use the thinking in threes is it's a framing. It's a good way for framing challenges. So what I like to do is when I'm faced with a situation or a particular problem on a disaster or even in my personal life is I always start, one, define the problem. A lot of people skip that step, but define the problem. Number two, people usually skip this step. Two is describe the outcome. What would success look like if you're able to overcome this problem? And then three is develop some 2 or 3 strategies to get there. And so that's just another example of how you can kind of use that three concept, the think in threes, the tool threes to get through crisis. That's one thing that we try to share a lot. And then I would say not the final one, but another one that a lot of people think is selfish, but it's almost counterintuitive. And I would say it's a relentless commitment to your personal well-being.
I like that.
And that is make sure you're getting a little exercise, make sure you're getting a lot of sleep, make sure you're eating as well as you can, make sure you're taking care of yourself. And actually, our FEMA's philosophy on a disaster is that our first priority is the health and welfare of the responders. And the thinking behind that is that if a responder gets hurt or if a responder has a mental breakdown or is overwhelmed by a situation, or if a responder arrives sick and is able to, then they just become another burden on the impacted community. And it's the same thing in a family situation. If you're sick, if you've taken a leadership role and all of a sudden you get sick or you get overwhelmed or you just add to the burden of your family. So it's that relentless commitment to personal well-being, I think is a really important strategic, tactical, tangible way to make a difference.
I love that.
Yeah, that's great tactical advice. While you were talking about stepping up in a leadership position, I was thinking when you've seen strong leaders motivate or help their teams focus, how do you think they do that? Because I think that directly translates to somebody who's going to be a leader for their family or for their neighborhood or their community. Like what quality? Because in those moments you have to corral people, or you have to make people stay motivated to do something or stay focused on a task. And so based on your experience, what have you seen them do?
Yeah, I love that question because I'm a constant student of leadership. Even when I'm watching everything going on like right now in Minnesota, right? Just watching the political leadership and everything else. I'm just constantly studying it. What has always inspired me are a couple different leadership characteristics. I would say a big one for me is optimism, and it's not fake. It's not delusional optimism. It's not unrealistic optimism. It's not fake optimism. But it's people who sincerely believe in the ability of people to rise to the occasions and communities to overcome a difficult time. And I think if you just look at the history of our country, there's not a challenge that we haven't overcome so far. Our track records, it's been rocky, it's been uneven, and we've dealt with some really difficult moments from everything from civil rights era to a civil war to world wars. But I think we've been overcome them. And every community I worked with has overcome their disasters. New Orleans came back. It took a lot longer than it should have been. So I would say, leaders who really have that faith in the ability to recover, and they express it. But they express it, I find, in a certain way. They talk about the challenges that everyone faces. And then they talk about the plan to deal with those challenges. And then they add the hope and the reason to be hopeful. So I admire leaders who are able to do that and step at that moment. I really admire leadership, and I think a really powerful leadership characteristic is the ability to own problems and own issues, even when they're not necessarily your fault. And you always sort of find three types of leaders in a crisis. In my book, it's like this, they have this path they can go through. They either are blamers or they're hiders, and you tell a leader who's tried to hide from the situation that you can usually define their stance, their position in a word beginning of D. They're distancing themselves, they're using distraction techniques, they're deferring responsibilities. And then you have the owners. The best leaders of all time are not reluctant owners. It's almost like they have this unbridled enthusiasm and almost, in a weird way, joy for this opportunity in their lives to tackle something really difficult. And I saw that in 9/11 for Giuliani, Mayor Giuliani, who now is, really complicated character in American political world. But at the time in 9/11, and you got to remember all the failure he had lived through. He had cancer. He had been a scandalous public divorce. He was at the end of his mayoral term. He had been dropped out of the Senate race for Hillary Clinton. His political career was over. And while he had had some success as a mayor, I think he was seen as somewhat a disappointing figure. Then 9/11 happened. And I didn't have a lot of personal interactions with him, but I was in the same room with him a lot. And it just like his stride, his posture, his positivity, his willingness to bring everyone together, never a discouraging word, his honesty, his ability to under-promise and then over-deliver on so many different small things. And it's just an example of someone who just it's almost like they've been waiting for this moment and they rush to this beginning of the line. They want to own the thing. They want to own it because they have so much confidence in their ability to make a difference. It's a very, very powerful thing. And I think anyone interested in leadership can begin developing that sort of thing and overcoming the fear of owner and taking responsibility when things go wrong, even if it's not 100% your fault. Because you don't want to be a spectator, you want to be a participant in fixing that. And then the final thing, not the final thing, but this ability to will things, to will success, to bring people together. And you see it a lot in sports. You see it in the military, where people just have this will, this belief to carry through tough times. And I've always been fascinated at how people develop that sort of will to get through. I think if you ever played sports, that kind of teaches you that failure isn't necessarily forever. It's a setback, and you have ability to grow strength like that, grow from those opportunities. I think will is ability maybe to have a vision for things and be able to articulate what that vision is and draw people into that. But I think that the best of the best just have this kind of relentless will to power through. And I love it. I see it. And that's why I think I love sports so much, Ellie and Will, because I'm a big 49ers fan. And I just saw the game against Philadelphia the other day, and I'm just going, their whole team they're decimated by injuries, and just like this will to survive and to win. It's just, it's really incredible, inspiring to me.
I think people also forget that we have a biological, just like it's innately built within us to want to survive. And I think that, I think you mentioned earlier that, when disaster happens, people don't necessarily have panic. They might have fear, which is just like a biological response to this crazy thing that's happening around you that is potentially life-threatening. But panic isn't as common as people might think it is. And I think that people cut themselves short in not understanding that, when something life-threatening is happening, your body does go into this biological response where it is going to feed you information of how to get out of it, how to escape to either, a safer place, or tell you that you need to find food or water or shelter or whatever the case may be. The people that listen to that biological response and trust their instincts in these moments where tensions are high and things might be a little bit chaotic seem to perform maybe a little bit better than the people that don't always listen to their intuition in those periods of time. But I'm interested in your thoughts on that because this is like my kind of personal opinion. I'm all about like, what do you feel inside and what are the vibes? Alex always laughs that I run a business off vibes sometimes.
No,
So
I'm there. I'm with you. I'm with you on that, Ellie. Yeah. I think people are constantly underestimating themselves and their ability to do it. And I think, yeah, a lot of it is instinctual, this willingness, this will to survive, the will to get through it. And, I think that's disasters that have failed for us. I think lots of times we've just been too reliant on process and we didn't trust what we were seeing. And we didn't trust what we felt. And so I'm a big believer in it. I'm a big believer. Now, I think to be, especially from professional, I think you do have to have gone through experiences before. I think you do have to have a basic foundation of some tactical experience and training, all that, and I think you have to have adopted some core values and beliefs. But if you have that sort of basic foundation, I think absolutely trust your ability. Like I always say, show up no matter what. Show up when your family needs you. Show up, when there's a crisis. Show up when there's something that's wrong with you. And just trust your ability to figure it out.
You guys both talk about this instinctual ability. I think that we really are creatures that recognize patterns. And to your point, if you've experienced this multiple times, you're going to pick up on commonalities and patterns, and your ability to make decisions based off of the patterns that you're seeing that may not be reflected in an SOP or a system is going to separate yourself and is going to allow you to make decisions that maybe seem from the gut or vibe, but it's because we're creatures of pattern recognition, and you're making a decision based off of prior evidence that maybe nobody else can see in that moment.
I agree with you. I really like this discussion, and I like where we're going on it. I would say trust your instincts, absolutely. I would say, put throughout your life, or with your kids, put them in situations where they have a chance to learn, develop critical thinking skills, maybe fail, and learn to bounce back from that. I would say all those things are super critical to developing your ability to handle tough times. And the more you learn to handle tough times, the more you'll be primed to make a difference when they strike. The other thing I would add, Alex, is decisiveness. I think it was Theodore Roosevelt who said, the best decision to make in a crisis is the right decision. The next best decision to make in a crisis is the wrong decision. And the worst decision to make in a crisis is no decision.
that's a really good point.
Right. And it's that ability to just be decisive and not get paralyzed and don't, what is it? Paralysis by analysis? Yeah. But sometimes you just got to make the call and go for it.
Most decisions you can walk back and you can
adjust.
You can adjust. And there's very few decisions that are permanent. And so to your point, make a decision, adjust, realign. If you need to walk it back, that's fine.
And to your point of kind of having the baseline, and the importance of, having either some type of training or having gone through repetitions or experiences, I think that people also can get a lot out of going through mental repetitions of different things. Not necessarily having to, be in a crazy crisis situation, but sitting at home and thinking, if this was to happen, what is my game plan? What are the things that I could go, and kind of going through different scenarios or steps inside your head and, your family and how you're going to handle that situation. And what if my spouse isn't home and is away at work? How do I coordinate with that? And kind of just going through the different scenarios and situations that can pop up. You'll be surprised at how much better I think people react if something actually does happen, just having gone through mental repetitions and preparation.
They have a plan in their head. And then, I don't know about you, but whenever I read a book or watch a movie, I always do that too. I always put myself in that position. How would I handle that?
Yeah. Or like if I'm driving and I see something on like the side of the road, I'm like, what would I do if this
Right.
happened? I go crazy. I'll be like sitting in a restaurant. I'm like, what do I do if an active shooter just happened right now? Like,
Hmm.
but I'm crazy. Not everyone has to think like that 24/7,
Right.
but that is how my brain functions.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if you ever like have gone out to dinner with a firefighter, but they walk into the restaurant, they're looking at the exits, and then they're looking at sprinkler systems, and they're constantly
I love it.
right.
Yes.
Hmm.
But no, I really appreciate it. I kind of want to leave it open to you before we kind of close out here. I think this was a really great conversation, and I think that it was really insightful for people listening and kind of getting those first steps of how to maybe think about or what to consider in the event, a crisis situation arises near them, as well as some, background on FEMA. But I kind of want to pass it over to you for any final information, advice, anything you want to leave the listeners off with.
Well, I'll do this. So the title of my book is "Promote the Dog Sitter," and other principles for leading. And so people might have a question: what does that title mean? So it's a metaphor, and it's based on an experience in 9/11 where we were helping manage the press relations for the search and rescue effort at Ground Zero in New York. And we were getting overwhelmed by requests for information about the search dogs. And so we needed someone to become the press agent for the search dogs. I looked around and said, well, let's give this guy a chance. His name was Doug Welty. And he just took that assignment and ran with it. And he knew every dog, he knew every handler, knew the dog's breeding, the background, their ability, understand the dog's position, the role of the team, and he made the search dogs famous. It was a very positive story that came out of 9/11. But it was something even more than that. This publicity for the dogs helped establish a lot of credibility and public recognition and congressional funding support for the urban search and rescue teams themselves, which were kind of on shaky ground before 9/11. Since then, these teams have saved thousands of lives, not only in the U.S., but around the world. He raised the profile of search dogs, and the federal search and rescue teams in 9/11 didn't rescue anybody. They only found bodies, not survivors, and they come back from the pile every day so defeated, and then the dogs would cheer them up. So the dogs didn't necessarily save anyone 9/11, but I think they saved a lot of firefighters. And Doug told that story. And I've had people from the American Kennel Society, 9/11 Museum, doctors and psychologists tell me that the publicity that Doug generated for the search dogs in 9/11 was really the reason that people began using therapy dogs at schools, hospitals, and nursing homes, because people saw the role of dogs in those sorts of situations. All that emerged from 9/11, and it is because of this one guy. So we promoted the dog sitter in 9/11, and he made a contribution not only for that disaster, but he made a contribution, I think, to the world. Doug was a guy that we had underestimated, overlooked, and really underappreciated before 9/11, and he stood up and just when you least expect it. And so I guess I just leave it at that. And, whether you have someone on your team or maybe even yourself, that it's just remarkable who is going to maybe rise to the moment if they prepare themselves emotionally and mentally and are willing to just show up. And so that's my promote the dog sitter.
I love that. That is so good. I need to literally buy that book right now, on which we will include a link for your book in our bio, so that if you are interested in checking it out, you can easily find it right there. But thank you so much, Ed, for coming on. This was this was an amazing conversation.
Oh, I had a
And
great
what a great
time.
way
Ellie,
to end it. Yes.
thank you so much. Alex,
Yes.
Ellie, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Ed.
you. Yes. And yep, like I said, we'll include everything in the bio, but thanks for joining and we'll see you next week.
Okay, take care.
See everybody.